No one in England spoke his name without lowering their voice. The Duke of Ashford had buried 3 marriage proposals, dismissed 2 earls, and left an entire season of society women without a second glance. He did not feel. He had decided that long ago. Then the door opened, the wrong door, the servants' entrance, and a young woman walked in with dust on her hem and a letter in her hand. She looked at him the way no one ever had, not with fear, not with desire, with absolute calm. "I'll sign whatever you require," she said. "I only ask one thing. Treat my brother as a man, not a debt." Dorian set down his glass, slowly, and for the first time in 11 years, he had no answer. "Before we go any further, if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. Every week we bring you a brand new story that will take your breath away. And I'd love to know your name. Tell me in the comments. I truly want to know who's watching." England, January 1843. The door opened before anyone announced her. That alone was enough to make every man in the room go still. Dorian Ashford stood by the window, his back half turned to the entrance, a glass of brandy untouched in his hand. He had spent the last hour listening to his solicitor explain, in careful and increasingly nervous detail, exactly how much of Thomas Vane's debt had become his problem. The number was not small, the situation was not clean, and his patience had reached its natural end. Then she walked in. She was not what he expected. Not that he had expected anyone. The meeting was private, the address known only to 3 people, and she was not one of them. She wore a dark wool coat, slightly damp at the hem. Her hair was pinned back with the kind of precision that takes effort to maintain. And her eyes, grey, steady, entirely too direct, moved across the room until they found him. She adjusted her gloves once. Then she stepped forward. "I know I wasn't invited," Iris said, "but my brother is not well enough to be here himself, so I came instead." The solicitor started to speak. Dorian raised one hand and the man went quiet. "Miss Vane." His voice carried no particular emotion. "This is not a conversation for you." "With respect, Your Grace, it became my conversation the moment my brother's name was written on that document." She reached into her coat and placed a folded letter on the table between them. She did not slide it toward him. She did not explain it. She simply set it down and waited. Dorian looked at the letter, then at her. Outside, the wind pushed against the glass. The fire in the grate crackled once and settled. His solicitor had stopped breathing, or so it seemed. "I'll sign whatever you require," Iris said. Her voice did not waver. "I only ask one thing. Treat my brother as a man, not a debt." The silence that followed was not the silence of refusal. It was something else entirely, the kind that fills a room when something unexpected has shifted the air. Dorian set his glass down on the mantelpiece, slowly. His eyes stayed on her face longer than they should have. She did not look away. For the first time in 11 years, he had no immediate answer. "Before we go any further." The solicitor cleared his throat. Dorian ignored him. He crossed the room in 4 measured steps and picked up the letter. He did not open it. He simply held it, his thumb pressed against the fold, and studied the woman standing across from him with an expression that gave nothing away. Nothing except perhaps the faintest trace of something he would have denied if asked. "You understand what you're proposing," he said. It was not a question. "Completely." "And your brother, does he know you're here?" Something crossed her face, brief, controlled, gone before he could name it. "He knows someone came," she said. Dorian held her gaze for a long moment. Then he walked back to the window, the letter still in his hand, and looked out at the grey January street below. A carriage passed. 2 women hurried along the pavement, heads bent against the cold. Ordinary life moving at its ordinary pace, entirely indifferent to what was happening in this room. "Come back tomorrow," he said finally. "Alone, 9 o'clock. Iris reached for her gloves on the table. She had removed them without realizing sometime during the exchange, and put them back on with deliberate calm. "I'll be here at 8, she said. She left before he could respond. Dorian stood at the window and listened to her footsteps fade down the corridor. His solicitor said something. He didn't hear it. His thumb moved slowly along the fold of the letter, still unopened, and his jaw tightened once before he caught himself. He had dismissed earls for less, and yet... She said 8. He had said 9. And when morning came, only one of them would be proven right about what that difference meant. The following morning. She was there at 8. Dorian knew before his butler said a word. He heard the front door, heard the brief exchange of voices in the entrance hall, and felt something in his chest do what he refused to name. He set down his coffee, stood, moved to his desk, and sat behind it, because a desk was a reasonable thing to put between himself and whatever that feeling was. When Iris walked in, she wore the same dark coat, different gloves, cream this time against the cold. She looked rested in a way that suggested she had not slept particularly well, but would not say so. She took the chair across from him without being invited, and folded her hands in her lap. "You're early," he said. "So you said 9, she replied. "I said 8. I was here first." He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the letter. The contents were not a surprise. Not exactly. Thomas Vane owed him £4,000 accumulated over 18 months through a series of decisions that ranged from unwise to catastrophic. The letter, however, was not about the debt. It was written in a hand that shook slightly at the edges, and it said in plain and dignified language that Thomas Vane was ill, that he had been ill for some time, that his sister did not know the full extent of it, and that he was asking not for forgiveness, not for charity, only for time. Dorian read it twice, then he placed it face down on the desk. "Your brother wrote this 3 weeks ago," he said. "Yes, before he sent you here." "He didn't send me." Her voice was even. "He wouldn't have. That's why I came on my own." Dorian leaned back in his chair and studied her, with the kind of attention he usually reserved for documents he didn't yet trust. She met it without discomfort. He had the distinct impression she had been looked at with suspicion before, and had long since decided it was other people's problem. Outside, snow had begun to fall, fine and unhurried, the kind that settles without announcing itself. Dorian watched a thin layer form on the windowsill and thought, without meaning to, about another January, 11 years ago, a different house, a different woman standing across from him with a letter in her hand. That woman had smiled when she delivered her news. She had seemed almost relieved. He had not thought about that smile in years. He thought about it now, briefly and without welcome, before he pulled himself back to the room. "What exactly are you proposing, Miss Vane?" Iris straightened slightly. Not from nerves, from precision. She had prepared this answer. "My brother's debt cleared in full in exchange with whatever arrangement you require. A contract, a term of service, a marriage if that is what the document demands." She said the last word, the way someone says a word they have practiced saying without reaction. "I'm not here to negotiate the terms, I'm here to honor them." The fire shifted in the grate. Snow continued to fall outside. "A marriage," Dorian repeated, his voice entirely flat. "If that is what it requires." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that the silence itself became a kind of answer, or the beginning of one. When he finally spoke, his voice carried something she couldn't quite place. "I swore 11 years ago that I would never marry again." Iris held his gaze. She did not flinch, did not soften, did not offer the sympathy most people would have reached for automatically. "I'm not asking you to love me, Your Grace," she said. "I'm asking you to sign a document." Something shifted behind his eyes, so small she almost missed it. A crack in the surface, hairline thin there and gone. He stood and walked to the window. The snow had thickened. Below, a servant crossed the courtyard with his head down, breath rising in small white clouds. Ordinary, unremarkable. Nothing like what was happening in this room. "Come back in 2 days," Dorian said, his back to her. "I'll have an answer." Iris rose from her chair. She picked up her gloves from the arm of it. She had removed them again without noticing, and took her time putting them back on. "I'll be here in 1, she said quietly. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. "The woman," she said without turning. "The one from 11 years ago, whatever she did. I'm sorry it still lives in this room with you." She left. Dorian stood at the window for a long time after her footsteps faded. The snow fell without sound. His hand pressed flat against the cold glass, and he stared at nothing in particular, while somewhere beneath the composure he had spent 11 years building, something shifted, quietly, without permission. He had not told her about a woman. She had named something he never said out loud, and when she came back the next day, he would have to decide what that meant. The next day, 8 o'clock, she was already inside when he came downstairs. Not in the study, in the entrance hall, speaking quietly with his housekeeper, Mrs. Crane, about something that made the older woman laugh. A real laugh, unguarded, the kind Dorian had not heard from her in some time. When Iris noticed him on the stairs, she simply turned and waited. Mrs. Crane composed herself and disappeared. "You're punctual," he said. "You're surprised," she replied. He said nothing to that, which she seemed to take as confirmation. The document was ready. His solicitor had drawn it up the previous evening, clean, precise, legally binding, a marriage in name, a term of 12 months, after which both parties would be free to pursue a quiet annulment on grounds of incompatibility. Thomas Vane's debt cleared the morning of the ceremony. No expectations beyond basic civility, no obligations beyond appearance at 2 social events per season. Iris read every line twice. She asked 3 questions, about the timeline, about her brother's access to medical care, about what happened if he died before the 12 months ended. Each question was specific. None of them were about herself. Dorian watched her read and felt something he hadn't expected, something close to respect. Not the polite kind, the kind that arrives without invitation and refuses to leave quietly. "It's fair," she said finally. "I didn't design it to be unfair." She looked up at him. "Most people in your position would have." He had no answer for that either. They signed. The solicitor witnessed. And just like that, without ceremony or sentiment, Iris Vane became the Duchess of Ashford, at least on paper, at least for now. The arrangement began simply enough. She took the east wing. He kept the west. Meals were separate unless guests required otherwise. She had access to the library, the garden, and the morning room. He asked only that she not enter his study without knocking. She knocked every time, he noticed. What he hadn't anticipated was how thoroughly she moved through a house without disturbing it. Most people, guests, staff, even his solicitor, carried a kind of noise with them. Not sound exactly, but presence. The awareness of being watched, of performing, of occupying space with intention. Iris occupied space the way weather did, simply there, undemanding, impossible to ignore. He found her in the library on the 3rd evening. She sat near the window with a book open in her lap, her legs tucked beneath her in a way that was entirely inappropriate for a duchess and entirely natural for a woman who had forgotten for a moment that anyone might see her. The lamp beside her cast a warm circle of light. Snow fell outside the window behind her. He almost left without speaking. "There's a gap on the 3rd shelf," she said without looking up, "between Fielding and Gibbon. Something was removed recently. The dust pattern is different." Dorian stopped. "My wife's copy of Burney, I had it moved." "Your first wife?" "Yes." She turned a page. "You don't have to explain." "I wasn't explaining." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I said it." He stood in the doorway a moment longer than he intended, watching the lamplight shift across her profile. Then he crossed to the far shelf, retrieved the book he had come for, and left. He was halfway down the corridor before he realized he hadn't needed that book at all. The days settled into a rhythm neither of them designed. Breakfast at separate hours, afternoons that occasionally overlapped, her in the garden despite the cold, him passing through on his way to the stables, both acknowledging each other with the particular economy of 2 people who have agreed without saying so, not to perform for one another. She asked him once about the east garden wall, which had partially collapsed sometime in autumn and hadn't been repaired. He told her the groundskeeper had been ill. She nodded and said nothing else. The following morning, he looked out his window and saw her in conversation with 2 of the estate workers, pointing at the wall with quiet authority. By afternoon, the repairs had begun. He didn't mention it at dinner. They dined together that evening because a neighbor had called unexpectedly, and appearances required it. But once the neighbor left and the table was cleared, he looked at her across the candlelight and said, "You didn't have to do that. The wall needed fixing," she said simply. "This house isn't your responsibility." Iris set down her glass. She looked at him with that steady grey gaze that had unsettled him from the first moment in his study. "For 12 months," she said, "it is." The candle between them flickered once. Neither of them moved. Outside, the wind pushed at the windows. The fire held. And Dorian looked at the woman across the table. This woman who had walked in uninvited, signed a contract without flinching, fixed his garden wall without being asked, and felt the particular discomfort of someone who has been seen more clearly than they intended. He reached for his glass. She picked up her book. The silence between them was not empty. It hadn't been empty for some time. That night, Dorian stood at his desk and opened the bottom drawer. the one he hadn't opened in 11 years. Inside, beneath a folded letter he never finished reading, was a small portrait. He closed the drawer before he looked at it, but his hand stayed on the handle for a long moment, and he didn't understand why until he did. 3 weeks later, he started noticing small things. The way she held her coffee cup with both hands on cold mornings, as though warmth was something to be held onto deliberately. The way she paused before answering a question she found interesting, not from uncertainty, but from the habit of thinking before speaking, which he had encountered so rarely in his life that it still caught him off guard. The way she never asked about the portrait in the drawing room, the one everyone asked about, and yet stood before it once for a long moment, and then moved on without a word. He told himself it was simply the nature of close quarters. 11 rooms or 2, you learned the patterns of whoever shared your walls. It meant nothing. He almost believed it. The shift came on a Thursday, during a storm that arrived without warning, and left the road to the village impassable by mid-afternoon. Dorian had a meeting cancelled, 2 letters unanswered, and no reasonable excuse to leave the house. Iris had apparently decided the same. He found her at the long table in the library with papers spread around her, working through what appeared to be his estate accounts. He stopped in the doorway. "Those are private," he said. She looked up without guilt. "Mrs. Crane asked me to review them. The household budget hasn't been properly balanced since October. There are 3 duplicate payments to the coal supplier and an invoice missing from the farrier." She turned 1 page toward him. "I flagged them." He crossed the room and looked at the page. She was right, all of it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. They worked in silence for an hour, him on correspondence, her on the accounts, with the storm pressing against the windows and the fire doing what fires do in old houses on bad afternoons. At some point Mrs. Crane brought tea. Neither of them acknowledged her, which seemed to please her enormously. "You've done this before," Dorian said eventually, without looking up from his letter. "My father's accounts from the time I was 17. He wasn't well with numbers." "And your brother?" A pause. "Thomas is gifted at many things," she said carefully. "Finance is not among them." He looked up then. She was already looking at him, not with the careful neutrality she usually maintained, but with something more open. Tired, perhaps. The kind of tired that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something for too long alone. "He's getting worse," Dorian said. "Not a question." She held his gaze for a moment. "Some days are better than others. You should visit him. I visit every Sunday." "I meant during the week. The carriage is available, you don't need to ask." Something moved across her face, quickly, like light through cloud cover. She looked back down at the accounts. "Thank you," she said quietly. It was the first time she had thanked him for anything. He found he wanted to be careful with it. The storm lasted through dinner, and well into the evening. They ate by the fire in the small sitting room because the dining room was cold, and formality, in a storm, felt absurd. Iris ate without pretense. She was hungry, the food was good, and she said so, which made the kitchen maid who brought the plate smile all the way back down the corridor. Dorian watched her, and thought about how different this was from every meal he had eaten in this house for the past 11 years. Quiet had always been his preference, but this was a different quiet, occupied, alive, warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. "Why did you never marry?" he asked. He hadn't planned to. She considered the question with the same honesty she gave everything. There was someone once. He decided in the end that Thomas's debts were too much of a risk. She said it without bitterness, which was somehow worse than bitterness would have been. "After that, I stopped looking." "How long ago?" 4 years. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the storm pushed hard against the glass. "He was a fool," Dorian said. Iris looked at him. He held her gaze without retreating from it. "Perhaps," she said softly, "or perhaps he simply knew himself well enough to be honest. There's no honor in honesty that costs someone else everything." She said nothing, but she didn't look away either, and the firelight moved across her face in a way that made it difficult for him to remember why he had stopped noticing things like that. Later, when she had gone upstairs, Dorian sat alone by the dying fire. He held his glass without drinking. The storm was easing. He could hear it pulling back, the wind losing its urgency, the house settling into its usual old stone quiet. He thought about what she had said, about the man who left, About 4 years of not looking, about the way she had thanked him for the carriage, not with relief, but with the particular grace of someone who had learned not to expect kindness and was still, somehow, capable of receiving it. He set the glass down. He had told himself 11 years ago that he was finished with this, with the specific vulnerability of caring what happened to another person. He had meant it. He had built his life around meaning it. And yet, he looked at the empty chair across from him, still slightly warm from where she had sat, and felt the distinct and unwelcome sensation of a man standing at the edge of something he had promised himself he would never approach again. He stood, went to bed, stared at the ceiling. Sleep, when it came, brought no particular relief. The following Sunday, he found himself watching the clock at the time she usually left for her brother's. The carriage was ready. She hadn't come down. And when he passed the morning room and saw her sitting very still with a letter open in her hands, he stopped. Because the expression on her face was one he recognized. He had worn it himself once, a long time ago. And it meant only one thing. That same Sunday morning, he knocked once. She didn't answer. Dorian opened the door anyway, which he had never done before, and found her exactly as he had seen through the gap, seated by the window, the letter open in her lap, her hands very still. The kind of stillness that isn't calm, the kind that comes after. Iris. She looked up. Her eyes were dry. That somehow was worse. Thomas won't be receiving visitors today, she said. Her voice was even, practiced. The doctor says he needs rest. What does the letter say? A pause. She folded it with care, the way you fold something you intend to read again many times alone. That he is comfortable, she said. That the staff is attentive, that I shouldn't worry. And? She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a carriage passed on the street below, its wheels loud against the frozen ground, and then gone. And that he wanted me to know before I heard it elsewhere. She set the letter on the table beside her, face down. He's not going to recover, Dorian. It was the first time she had used his name. Neither of them acknowledged it, but the air in the room shifted slightly, irrevocably, the way air does when something true has been said out loud for the first time. He didn't leave. He wasn't sure why. He had no particular talent for comfort, had avoided it deliberately for years, had built his entire existence around the principle that other people's grief was theirs to carry. But he crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest her, and said nothing and stayed. She didn't cry. She looked out the window at the grey January street and was quiet for a long time, and he sat beside her and let the silence be what it needed to be. After a while she said, "He knew when he sent me here. He knew he was running out of time and he wanted the debt settled before—" She stopped, started again. "He didn't tell me how serious it was. He let me believe it was manageable. He was protecting you. He was deciding for me." Her voice didn't rise. It sharpened briefly and then softened again. "I would have come anyway. I just would have come knowing." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Something about the way she said it, "I would have come anyway," landed somewhere he hadn't expected. "My first wife," he said. Iris turned her head slowly. "She was ill when we married. I didn't know. She didn't tell me until after the ceremony. She thought I wouldn't agree if I knew." He looked at his hands. She was probably right. I was 27 and entirely unprepared for what love actually costs. A pause. She died 14 months later, and I spent the years after that deciding it was the not knowing that broke me, that if she had simply told me the truth— He stopped. Iris waited. "I think," he said slowly, "I was wrong about that." The fire shifted in the grate. Snow had begun again outside, light, indifferent, settling on the window ledge without sound. "What were you wrong about?" she asked quietly. "It wasn't the not knowing." He looked at her. "It was the losing. I confused the two for 11 years because one of them I could have prevented and one of them I couldn't. It was easier to be angry at the secret." Iris held his gaze. Something in her expression had changed, opened fractionally in the way a door opens when the latch is finally released after long resistance. "Her name," she said softly. "What was her name?" "Catherine." She nodded once, as though the name deserved to exist in the room, to be spoken aloud, to be given its weight. "She sounds," Iris said, "like someone who loved you very much and made a very human mistake." Dorian said nothing, but his jaw tightened once and his eyes moved to the window, and for a long moment he simply breathed, which was, she understood, the most honest thing he was capable of just then. They stayed in the morning room for another hour. At some point, Mrs. Crane brought tea without being asked. At some point, the snow stopped. The letter sat face down on the table between them, and neither of them touched it, and the silence that had once been careful and managed was now something else entirely. Open, inhabited, warm in a way that neither of them had planned for. When Iris finally stood to go upstairs, she paused at the door. "Dorian." He looked up. "Thank you for staying." He nodded once she left. He sat alone with the cold tea and the dying fire, and looked at the chair where she had been and understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 11 years avoiding exactly this, that he was in a great deal of trouble. That evening he went to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. He took out the folded letter, the one he had never finished reading, the one Catherine had left for him, the one he had buried under 11 years of deliberate silence. He sat for a long time with it in his hands. Then he opened it. It was short, 4 sentences. The last one read, "I hope one day you let someone in again, not for my sake, for yours. You were never meant to live in an empty house." He folded it carefully and placed it on top of the desk, instead of back in the drawer, and sat with that for a very long time. He had spent 11 years angry at a secret. Now the secret was gone, and what remained was something far more difficult to ignore. 2 days later, a visitor arrived at Ashford House unannounced, and everything Iris had carefully kept to herself walked through the front door with him. 2 days later, the man's name was Lord Harwick. He arrived at 10:30 without a card, without an appointment, and with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to doors opening before he knocked. Dorian was in the stables when the butler found him. By the time he reached the entrance hall, Harwick was already inside, standing with his hat in his hands looking around the house with the slow, deliberate attention of a man calculating its value. Iris stood at the foot of the stairs. She had gone very still in the way Dorian had come to recognize, not fear, not retreat, but the absolute composure of someone containing something large and keeping it contained through sheer will. Her hands were at her sides, no gloves. "Lord Harwick," Dorian said from the doorway. The man turned. He was perhaps 50, well-dressed, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now wore its age like a grievance. "Ashford," he smiled without warmth. "I hope I haven't called at an inconvenient time." "You have," Dorian said pleasantly. "Come through." In the study, with the door closed, Harwick settled into a chair with the ease of someone who believed all chairs were meant for him. Dorian remained standing. Iris had followed them in, which Harwick noted with a glance and a smile that managed to be condescending without a single word. "I'll be brief," Harwick said. "I was a close associate of the late Mr. Vane, Iris's father. There was an arrangement between our families made some years ago that was never formally dissolved." "What arrangement?" Dorian said. "A betrothal." Harwick's eyes moved to Iris with something that was not quite affection. "Iris and my son, Richard, agreed upon when she was 19. Her father signed the preliminary papers." The room was very quiet. Dorian looked at Iris. Her expression had not changed, which told him everything. "She is my wife," Dorian said. His voice carried no particular heat, it didn't need to. "A recent development," Harwick said smoothly, "and one made, I would argue, under circumstances that warrant examination. The Vane family debt, the speed of the arrangement, a court would find it interesting, I think." "What is it you want, Harwick?" The man leaned forward slightly. "I want what was agreed. Richard has waited long enough. If Miss Vane, the Duchess, forgive me, wishes to avoid a very public and very unpleasant legal challenge to this marriage, then a quiet annulment, agreed upon by both parties, would serve everyone's interests." He stood, smoothed his coat. "I'll give you a week to consider it," he said. "I'm sure you'll both be reasonable." After he left, the house felt different, smaller somehow, as though Harwick had taken some of the air with him on his way out. Iris stood at the window. Dorian stood near the desk. Neither spoke for a moment. "You knew," he said finally. "Not an accusation, a question." "I knew there had been papers," she said. "My father mentioned them once, years ago. I didn't know Harwick still considered them binding." She turned from the window. "I should have told you." "Yes. I was afraid," she said simply, "that it would change things before they had a chance to become something." He looked at her. The afternoon light came through the window behind her, and she stood in it without apology, honest, tired, slightly braced for whatever came next. "His son," Dorian said. "Richard, did you know him?" "Briefly, he was not unkind." A pause. He was also not someone I would have chosen, and yet your father signed. My father made many decisions without asking me. Her voice was quiet without bitterness. I stopped being surprised by that a long time ago. Dorian moved to the window and stood beside her. Below, Harwick's carriage was pulling away from the gate. He watched it until it turned the corner and disappeared. He won't stop at one visit, Dorian said. No. And a legal challenge, even an unsuccessful one, would be damaging. To your brother's situation, to the estate. I know. He was quiet for a moment, then, I have no intention of agreeing to an annulment. Iris turned her head and looked at him. His eyes stayed on the street below. His jaw was set. His voice, when he continued, was entirely level, which she had learned meant he was being more honest than he appeared. Not because of the legal challenge, he said, and not because of the estate. She waited. He didn't finish the sentence, but he turned and looked at her, and the thing he didn't say sat between them, present, undeniable, requiring nothing more than acknowledgement to become real. She held his gaze. Then she did something she hadn't planned. She reached out and placed her hand over his, where it rested on the window ledge. Briefly, deliberately. Then we face him together, she said. He looked down at her hand, then back at her face. Yes, he said quietly. We do. That evening, Dorian wrote 2 letters, one to his solicitor, and one to a man in London who owed him a significant favour. He sealed both and gave them to the night courier without explanation. Then he sat at his desk for a long time, in the silence of the house, and thought about a hand placed over his without hesitation, about grey eyes that had never once looked at him with anything less than full honesty, about what it meant that, for the first time in 11 years, the house did not feel empty. He was still thinking about it when the clock struck midnight. The solicitor's reply arrived 4 days later. What it contained changed the shape of everything, not just Harwick's claim, but something Dorian had believed about himself since the night Catherine died. And when he told Iris, she went very quiet. Then she did the one thing he hadn't expected. She left. 4 days later evening, he told her in the library. He had meant to be measured about it, to present the information clearly, to give her time to process, to be the kind of steady presence she had been for him in the morning room when the letter about Thomas arrived. He had rehearsed it briefly, which was not something he did. It didn't matter. The moment he said Harwick's name, she went still, and the moment he finished, she stood and walked to the window, and he understood from the set of her shoulders that something had shifted in a direction he hadn't anticipated. The preliminary papers your father signed, he said carefully. My solicitor found a clause. They were contingent on your father's financial standing at the time of the formal agreement. Given the debts, given everything, they're not legally binding. Harwick has no case. I know, she said quietly. He waited. I knew 2 days ago. Thomas told me. He found the same clause years ago and never said anything because he thought Harwick would simply disappear. She turned from the window. Her face was composed and entirely unreadable. I should have told you immediately. I didn't. Why? A long pause. Because once Harwick is gone, she said, there is no external reason for this marriage to continue. The fire crackled. Outside, wind moved through the bare trees in the east garden, the one she had repaired, the wall now straight and solid against the winter dark. The 12 months, he began, were always a formality, she said. We both know that. He crossed the room toward her. She took one step back, not from fear, but from the particular self-protection of someone who has decided, quietly and painfully, to do the harder thing. Iris, I'm not a substitute, she said. Her voice was steady and it cost her. For Catherine, for the life you had before, I came here to save my brother and I... She stopped. I didn't come here to become something you settle for because the house felt empty. That's not... I need you to be certain, she said. Not grateful, not comfortable, certain. He stood very close to her now, close enough that he could see the effort it took her to hold his gaze, the slight tension at the corner of her jaw, the way her hands stayed perfectly still at her sides. He had so much to say. He found in the moment that he could say none of it, not with the weight she deserved, not with the precision her honesty required. Everything he reached for felt insufficient. So he said nothing. And she, who had learned to read his silences better than most people read words, understood that his nothing was not indifference, but she needed more than silence, and he wasn't ready to give it yet. I think, she said softly. "I need a few days." She went to Thomas. She told Mrs. Crane she would be away for 3 days, took the carriage and left before breakfast. Dorian stood at the window of his study and watched the carriage move down the drive and turn onto the road and disappear behind the tree line, and felt the particular quality of an absence that is different from all previous absences, because you understand for the first time that it matters. The house was quiet. It had always been quiet. It had never felt like this before. The first day he worked, letters, accounts, 2 meetings with his land steward that he got through on discipline alone. He ate alone at the long dining table and noticed, without meaning to, that the room had never felt particularly large until now. The second day he didn't work. He walked the east garden in the cold, hands in his coat pockets, and looked at the repaired wall and thought about a woman who had fixed something that wasn't her responsibility, because for 12 months it was. He thought about grey eyes and folded letters and the specific courage of someone who walks through the wrong door without flinching. He thought about Catherine, not with the old grief, the complicated anger, but with something gentler, something that felt, for the first time, like peace. You were never meant to live in an empty house. He had read those words 100 times in his mind since the night he opened the letter. He was only now understanding them. The third day he went to his desk and wrote. Not a letter to his solicitor, not correspondence. Something he hadn't written in 11 years. Something honest, without strategy, without the careful architecture of a man protecting himself from his own feelings. He wrote until the candle burned low. Then he read it back. Then he called for the carriage. He arrived at Thomas Vane's house at 7:30 in the evening. The butler showed him to the sitting room. He waited. And when Iris appeared in the doorway, coat still on, as though she had just come in from the garden, her hair slightly wind-touched, her eyes careful and tired and entirely herself, he stood up, and for the first time in 11 years, Dorian Ashford had no interest in protecting himself from what he was about to say. That same evening, she didn't sit down. Neither did he. They stood in Thomas's small sitting room with a single lamp between them and the sound of the house settling around them in the cold, and Iris looked at him with the careful eyes of someone who has hoped before and knows exactly what hoping costs. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know." "Dorian, let me finish." She closed her mouth, waited. He reached into his coat and took out the pages he had written. He didn't hand them to her. He held them for a moment, looked at them, and then set them on the table beside him. "I wrote it all down," he said. "Everything I wanted to say, I rewrote it 4 times, and then I realized that if I read it to you, I would be hiding behind it. So..." He looked at her directly. "I am not grateful," he said. "I am not comfortable. I am not filling a silence or replacing something I lost." He paused. "I am a man who spent 11 years deciding he was finished, and who was wrong. Not because you changed me, because you were simply, consistently, entirely yourself, and that was enough. And..." Iris was very still. "You fixed my garden wall," he said. "You read my accounts without being asked. You sat with me when I opened a letter I had been afraid of for 11 years. You told me the truth when it would have been easier to say nothing. You walked into my house uninvited and looked at me without fear and said..." His voice shifted, quieter, more careful. "Treat my brother as a man, not a debt." She exhaled slowly. "I have been certain," he said, "for longer than I was ready to admit. I needed you to leave so I could understand what that meant." The lamp flickered once between them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, gentle now, tired of its own noise. Iris looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he felt the full weight of it, the consideration, the honesty, the particular courage of a woman who doesn't give herself away easily and means it completely when she does. Then she crossed the room. She stopped in front of him, close, deliberate, and reached into her coat pocket. She took out her gloves and set them on the table beside his pages. She had removed them before she came inside. She hadn't put them back on. She looked up at him. "I came here," she said softly, "to save my brother. I didn't come here to fall in love with a man who keeps brandy. He never drinks and opens doors he was afraid of, and sits with people in the dark because he doesn't know how to say he cares." A pause. "And yet..." His hand came up slowly and touched her face, just her jaw, just the edge of it, a question more than a statement. She leaned into it, slightly, enough. "Certain?" she asked. "Completely," he said. He kissed her. It was not hurried, it was not desperate. It was the kiss of two people who have chosen each other with full knowledge of what choosing costs, and chosen anyway. The lamp burned steadily between the pages and the gloves and the 11 years and the 4 months and everything that had quietly, irrevocably become something real. When they stepped back, she was still close. Her hand rested against his chest. His stayed at her jaw. "The 12 months," she said quietly. "Are irrelevant," he said. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile, fully, without reservation, and it was, he thought, the finest thing in the room. Thomas received them together when they went upstairs. He was propped against pillows, thinner than Dorian had expected, with sharp eyes and a dry wit that explained immediately a great deal about Iris. He looked at Dorian for a long moment and then said, "You took long enough." "Thomas," Iris said, "I'm ill, not blind." He looked at his sister with an expression that carried years of love and guilt and relief in equal measure. "Are you happy?" She looked at Dorian. He looked at her. "Yes," she said simply. Thomas nodded once, satisfied, and asked for tea. They drove back to Ashford House in the dark, the carriage moving through the frozen countryside with the particular quiet of a winter night that has decided to be still. Iris sat beside him, not across beside, her shoulder against his, her head tilted slightly toward the window. At some point his hand found hers in the dark. She turned her palm up and held it. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing that needed saying. The gates of Ashford House came into view. The lights were on. Mrs. Crane, ever knowing, had left them burning. The east garden wall stood solid and straight against the night sky. Dorian looked at it as the carriage turned up the drive. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for fixing the wall." Iris looked at him, a small smile. "It needed doing," she said. Spring, 3 months later. The window in the library was open for the first time. Iris noticed it before she saw him, the curtain moving in the morning air, the smell of the garden coming through, green and cold and new. She stopped in the doorway. Dorian stood at the shelf, returning a book, unhurried. He turned when he heard her. "You opened the window," she said. "It was warm." She crossed the room and stood beside him. Below, the east garden was coming back, the first green pushing through the dark earth, the repaired wall holding everything in place. A gardener moved along the far path with a wheelbarrow. Ordinary, unhurried, alive. Dorian reached for her hand. She gave it without looking. On the table behind them, her gloves lay folded beside his morning correspondence, left there the way you leave something you no longer need to hold on to. The curtain moved again in the light spring air. The house, for the first time in 11 years, did not feel empty. It felt like hers, like his, like something they had built quietly and without plan from the wreckage of everything that came before. Outside, the garden grew.
She walked through the rondo with dust upon her hem, a letter in her trembling hands, and nothing left to spend. She looked at him without a fear, the way no one had done, and said, "I'll sign whatever you need, just spare my brother's son." He set his glass down slowly, his silence filled the room. For the first time in 11 years, he had no answer to. Until her, he had closed every door. Until her, he had felt nothing more. 11 years of winter locked inside his chest. Until her, he forgot how to rest. She fixed the broken garden wall. She never asked for praise. She sat with him in quiet rooms through cold and endless days. He watched her hold her coffee cup like warmth was something rare, and tried to tell himself it meant nothing, nothing there. But the empty chair still held her heat, the silence held her name, and the house that swore it felt no cold was never quite the same. Until he had closed every door. Until he had felt nothing more. 11 years of winter locked inside his chest. Until he forgot how to rest. She said, I'm not a substitute for what you had before. I came here just to save my brother, nothing else, nothing more. He drove through frozen countryside with pages in his coat. He set them on the table and said everything she wrote. I am not grateful, I am not afraid. I am a man who was finished until you stayed. Until he had closed every door. Until he had found nothing more. 11 years of winter melted from his chest because of her, because of her. He finally came to rest. She left her gloves upon the table. He opened up the window wide. The garden grew in early spring, and so did something else inside.